Book 3. Toward Bethlehem. How with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Shakespeare, Sonnet 65. 1. Vivaldo dreamed that he was running through a country he had always known, but could not now remember, a rocky country. He was blinded by the rain beating down, the tough, wet vines dragged at his legs and feet, and thorns and nettles tormented his hands and arms and face. He was both fleeing and seeking, and, in his dream, the time was running out. There was a high wall ahead of him, a high stone wall. Broken glass glittered on top of the wall, sharp points standing straight up like spears. He was reminded of music, though he heard none. The music was created by the sight of the rain, which fell in long, cruel, gleaming shafts, and by the bright glass, which reared itself bitterly against it. And he felt an answering rearing in his own body, a pull fugitive and powerful and dimly troubling, such as he might have felt for a moment had there been the movement and power of a horse beneath him. And, at the same time, in his dream, as he ran or as he was propelled, he was weighed down and made sick by the certainty that he had forgotten what? Some secret, some duty that would save him. His breath was a terrible captive weight in his chest. He reached the wall. He grasped the stone with his bleeding hands, but the stone was slippery. He could not hold it, could not lift himself up. He tried with his feet. His feet slipped. The rain poured down. And now he knew that his enemy was upon him. Salt burned his eyes. He dared not turn. In terror, he pressed himself against the rough, wet wall, as though a wall could melt or could be entered. Had he forgotten what? How to escape or how to defeat his enemy? Then he heard the wail of trombones and clarinets and a steady, enraged beating on the drums. They were playing a blues he had never heard before. They were filling the earth with a sound so dreadful that he knew he could not bear it. Where was Ida? She could help him. But he felt rough hands on him, and he looked down into Rufus's distorted and vindictive face. "Go on up," said Rufus. "I'm helping you up. Go up." Rufus's hands pushed, and soon Vivaldo stood, higher than Rufus had ever stood, on the wintry bridge, looking down on death. He knew that this death was what Rufus most desired. He tried to look down, to beg Rufus for mercy, but he could not move without falling off the wall or falling on the glass. From far away, far beyond this flood, he saw Ida on a sloping green meadow, walking alone. The sun was beautiful on her blue-black hair and on her Aztec brow, and gathered in a dark, glinting pool at the hollow of her throat. She did not look toward him, walked in a measured way, looking down at the ground. Yet he felt that she saw him, was aware of him standing on the cruel wall, and waited, in collusion with her brother, for his death. Then Rufus came hurtling from the air, impaling himself on the far, spiked fence which bounded the meadow. Ida did not look. She waited. Vivaldo watched Rufus's blood run down, bright red over the black spikes, into the green meadow. He tried to shout, but no words came. Tried to reach out to Ida, and fell heavily on his hands and knees on the rearing, uplifted glass. He could not bear the pain. Yet he felt again the random, voluptuous tug. He felt entirely helpless, and more terrified than ever. But there was pleasure in it. He writhed against the glass. "Don't kill me, Rufus. Please, please, I love you." Then, to his delight and confusion, Rufus lay down beside him and opened his arms. And the moment he surrendered to this sweet and overwhelming embrace, his dream, like glass, shattered. He heard the rain at the windows, returned violently into his body, became aware of his odor and the odor of Eric, and found that it was Eric to whom he clung, who clung to him. Eric's lips were against Vivaldo's neck and chest. Vivaldo hoped that he was dreaming still. A terrible sorrow entered him. because he was dreaming and because he was awake. Immediately, he felt that he had created his dream in order to create this opportunity. He had brought about something that he had long desired. He was frightened, and then he was angry. At Eric or at himself? He did not know, and started to pull away. But he could not pull away. He did not want to. It was too late. He thought to keep his eyes closed in order to take no responsibility for what was happening. This thought made him ashamed. He tried to reconstruct the way in which this monstrous endeavor must have begun. They must have gone to sleep, spoon fashion. Eric curled against him. Oh, what did this cause him nearly to remember? He had curled his legs himself around Eric, since Eric's body was there, and desire had entered this monastic, this boyish bed. Now it was too late. Thank God it was too late. It was necessary for them to disentangle themselves from the drag and torment of their undershorts, their trousers, and the sheets. He opened his eyes. Eric was watching him with a small half-smile, a troubled smile, and this smile caused Vivaldo to realize that Eric loved him. Eric really loved him, and would be proud to give Vivaldo anything Vivaldo needed. With a groan and a sigh, with an indescribable relief, Vivaldo came full awake and pulled Eric closer. It had been a dream and not a dream. How long could such dreams last? This one could not last long. Instantaneously, then, they each seemed to become intent on carrying this moment, which belonged to them, as far as it could go. They kicked their trousers to the floor, saying nothing. What was there to say? And not daring to let go of one another. Then, as in a waking dream, helpless and trustful, he felt Eric remove his shirt and caress him with his parted lips. Eric bowed and kissed Vivaldo on the belly button, half hidden in the violent, gypsy hair. This was in honor of Vivaldo's body, and Vivaldo's need, and Vivaldo trembled as he had never trembled before. And this caress was not entirely pleasant. Vivaldo felt terribly ill at ease, not knowing what was expected of him, or what he could expect from Eric. He pulled Eric up and kissed him on the mouth, kneading Eric's buttocks and stroking his sex. How strange it felt, this violent muscle, stretching and throbbing, so like his own, but belonging to another. And this chest, this belly, these legs, were like his, and the tremor of Eric's breath echoed his own earthquake. Oh, what was it that he could not remember? It was his first sexual encounter with a male in many years, and his very first sexual encounter with a friend. He associated the act with the humiliation and the debasement of one male by another, the inferior male of less importance than the crumpled, cast-off handkerchief. But he did not feel this way toward Eric, and therefore he did not know what he felt. This tormented self-consciousness caused Vivaldo to fear that their moment might, after all, come to nothing. He did not want this to happen. He knew his need to be too great, and they had come too far, and Eric had risked too much. He was afraid of what might happen if they failed. Yet his lust remained, and rose, chafing within and battering against the labyrinth of his bewilderment. His lust was unaccustomedly arrogant and cruel and irresponsible, and yet there was mingled in it a deep and incomprehensible tenderness. He did not want to cause Eric pain. The physical pain he had sometimes brought to vanished phantom girls had been necessary for them. He had been unlocking, for them, the door to life. But he was now involved in another mystery, at once blacker and more pure. He tried to will himself back into his adolescence, grasping Eric's strange body and stroking that strange sex. At the same time, he tried to think of a woman, but he did not want to think of Ida. And they lay together in this antique attitude, the hand of each on the sex of the other, and with their limbs entangled, and Eric's breath trembling against Vivaldo's chest. This childish and trustful tremor returned to Vivaldo a sense of his own power. He held Eric very tightly and covered Eric's body with his own, as though he were shielding him from the falling heavens. But it was also as though he were, at the same instant, being shielded by Eric's love. It was strangely and insistently double-edged. It was like making love in the midst of mirrors, or it was like death by drowning. But it was also like music, the highest, sweetest, loneliest reeds, and it was like the rain. He kissed Eric again and again, wondering how they would finally come together. The male body was not mysterious. He had never thought about it at all, but it was the most impenetrable of mysteries now. And this wonder made him think of his own body, of its possibilities and its imminent and absolute decay, in a way that he had never thought of it before. Eric moved against him, and beneath him, as thirsty as the sand. He wondered what moved in Eric's body, which drove him, like a bird or a leaf in a storm, against the wall of Vivaldo's flesh. And he wondered what moved in his own body. What virtue were they seeking, now, to share? What was he doing here? This was as far removed as anything could be from the necessary war one underwent with women. He would have entered her by now. This woman who was not here, her size would be different, and her surrender would never be total. Her sex, which afforded him his entry, would nevertheless remain strange to him, an incitement and an anguish, and an everlasting mystery. And even now, in this bright, laboring and doubting moment, with only the rain as their witness, he knew that he was condemned to women. What was it like to be a man, condemned to men? He could not imagine it, and he felt a quick revulsion, quickly banished, for it threatened his ease. But at the very same moment, his excitement increased. He felt he could do with Eric whatever he liked. Now, Vivaldo, who was accustomed himself to labor, to be the giver of the gift, and enter into his satisfaction by means of the satisfaction of a woman, surrendered to the luxury, the flaming torpor of passivity, and whispered in Eric's ear a muffled, urgent plea. The dream teetered on the edge of nightmare. How old was this rite, this act of love? How deep? In impersonal time? In the actors? He felt that he had stepped off a precipice into an air which held him inexorably up, as the salt sea holds the swimmer, and seemed to see vastly and horribly down into the bottom of his heart, that heart which contained all the possibilities that he could name, and yet others that he could not name. Their moment was coming to its end. He moaned, and his thighs, like the thighs of a woman, loosened. He thrust upward as Eric thrust down. How strange, how strange! Was Eric, now, silently sobbing and praying as he, over Ida, silently sobbed and prayed? But Rufus had certainly thrashed and throbbed, feeling himself mount higher, as Vivaldo thrashed and throbbed and mounted now. Rufus, Rufus. Had it been like this for him? And he wanted to ask Eric, what was it like for Rufus? What was it like for him? Then he felt himself falling, as though the weary sea had failed, had wrapped him about, and he were plunging down as he desperately thrust and struggled upward. He heard his own harsh breath coming from far away. He heard the drumming rain. He was being overtaken. He remembered how Ida, at the unbearable moment, threw back her head and thrashed and bared her teeth. And she called his name. And Rufus? Had he murmured at last, in a strange voice, as he now heard himself murmur, "Oh, Eric, Eric!" What was that fury like? Eric! He pulled Eric to him through the ruined sheets and held him tight. And, "Thank you," Vivaldo whispered. "Thank you, Eric. Thank you." Eric curled against him like a child, and salt from his forehead dripped onto Vivaldo's chest. Then they lay together, close, hidden and protected by the sound of the rain. The rain came down outside like a blessing, like a wall between them and the world. Vivaldo seemed to have fallen through a great hole in time, back to his innocence. He felt clear, washed, and empty, waiting to be filled. He stroked the rough hair at the base of Eric's skull, delighted and amazed by the love he felt. Eric's breath trembled against the hairs of his chest. From time to time, he touched Vivaldo with his lips. This luxury and this warmth made Vivaldo heavy and drowsy. He slowly began drifting off to sleep again, beams of light playing in his skull, behind his eyes, like the sun. But beneath this peace and this gratitude, he wondered what Eric was thinking. He wanted to open his eyes, to look into Eric's eyes, but this was too great an effort and risked, furthermore, shattering his peace. He stroked Eric's neck and back slowly, hoping that his joy was conveyed by his fingertips. At the same time, he wondered, and it almost made him laugh, after all that shit I was talking last night, what he was doing. In this bed, in the arms of this man, who was the dearest man on earth for him. He felt fantastically protected, liberated, by the knowledge that, no matter where, once the clawing day descended, he felt compelled to go, no matter what happened to him from now until he died, and even, or perhaps especially, if they should never lie in each other's arms again. There was a man in the world who loved him. All of his hope, which had grown so pale, flushed into life again. He loved Eric. It was a great revelation. But it was yet more strange, and made for an unprecedented steadiness and freedom, that Eric loved him. Eric? They opened their eyes and looked at each other. Eric's dark blue eyes were very clear and candid, but there was a terrible fear in their depth, too, waiting. Vivaldo said, "It was wonderful for me, Eric." He watched Eric's face. "Was it for you?" "Yes," Eric said, and he blushed. They spoke in whispers. "I suppose that I needed it more than I knew. It may never happen again." "I know." There was a silence. Then, "Would you like it to happen again?" Then Vivaldo was silent, feeling frightened for the first time. "I don't know how to answer that," he said. "Yes and no. But just the same, I love you, Eric. I always will. I hope you know that." He was astonished to hear how his voice shook. "Do you love me? Tell me that you do." "You know I do," said Eric. He stared into Vivaldo's worn, white face, and raised one hand to stroke the stubble, which began just below the cheekbone. "I love you very much. I'd do anything for you. You must have known it, no, somewhere for a very long time, because I must have loved you for a very long time." "Is that true? I didn't know I knew it." "I didn't know it either," Eric said. He smiled. "What a funny day this is. It begins with revelations." "They're opening up," said Vivaldo. "All those books in heaven." He closed his eyes. The telephone rang. "Oh, shit." "More revelations," Eric grinned. He reached over Vivaldo for a cigarette and lit it. "It's too early, baby. Can't we go back to sleep?" The phone rang and rang. "It's 1 o'clock, said Eric. He looked doubtfully from Vivaldo to the ringing telephone. "It's probably Cass. She'll call back. Or it may be Ida. She probably won't call back." Eric picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Vivaldo heard, dimly, from far away, Cass's voice rushing through the wires. "Good morning, baby. How are you?" cried Eric. Then he fell into silence. Something in the quality of that silence caused Vivaldo to come full awake and sit straight up. He watched Eric's face, then he lit himself a cigarette and waited. "Oh," said Eric, after a moment. Then, "Jesus. Oh, my poor Cass." The voice went on and on, Eric's face becoming more troubled and more weary. "Yes, but now it has happened. It's here. It's upon us." He looked briefly at Vivaldo, then looked over at his watch. "Yes, certainly. Where?" He looked toward the window. "Cass, it doesn't look as though it's likely to let up." Then, "Please, Cass, please don't." His face changed again, registering shock. He glanced at Vivaldo and said quickly, "Vivaldo's here. We didn't go anywhere. We just stayed here." A dry, bitter smile touched his lips. "That's what they say, and it sure as hell is pouring to beat the band now." He laughed. "No, nobody lives without cliches. What?" He listened. He said gently, "But I'm going to be in rehearsal very soon, Cass, and I may be going to the coast, and besides—" He looked over at Vivaldo with a heavy, helpless frown. "Yes, I understand that, Cass. Yes, at 4. Okay, you hold on, baby. You just hold on." He hung up. He sat for a moment, turned, staring toward the rain, then lowered his gaze to Vivaldo with a small smile, both sad and proud. He looked at his watch again, put out his cigarette, and lay back, staring at the ceiling, his head resting on his arms. "Well, guess what? The shit has hit the fan. Cass got in late last night, and she and Richard had a fight. About us. Richard knows about us." Vivaldo whistled, his eyes very big. "I knew you shouldn't have answered that phone. What a mess. Is Richard on his way down here with a shotgun? And how did he find out?" Eric looked strangely guilty. Then he said, "Oh, Cass wasn't at her most coherent. I don't really know. Anyway, how he found out hardly matters now, since he has." He sat up. "Apparently, he has been suspicious, but he was suspicious of you." "Of me? He must be crazy." "Well, Cass kept coming to see you all the time. That's what she told him anyway." "And what did he think Ida was doing while Cass and I were screwing? Reading us bedtime stories?" Again, Eric looked uncomfortable, but he laughed. "I don't know what he thought. Anyway, Cass says that he's very bitter against you because—" He faltered for a moment and looked down. "Because you knew about the affair, and you're supposed to be his friend, and you didn't tell him." He watched Vivaldo. "Do you think you should have told him?" Vivaldo put out his cigarette. "What a wild idea. I'm nobody's goddamn Boy Scout. Besides, you and Cass are my friends, not Richard." "Well, he didn't know that. You've known him much longer than you've known me, and Richard doesn't really like me very much, so he'd naturally expect you to be loyal to him." Vivaldo sighed. "There's a hell of a lot that Richard doesn't know, and that's too bad, but it's not my fault. And he's being dishonest. He knows that we haven't really been friends for a long time, and I won't be made to feel guilty." Then he grinned. "I've got enough to feel guilty about." "Do you feel guilty?" They stared at each other for a moment. Vivaldo laughed. "That wasn't what I had in mind. But no, I don't feel guilty. And I hope to God that I never feel guilty again. It's a monstrous waste of time." Eric looked down. "Yes, Cass says that Richard may try to see you today." "Sounds just like him. Well, I'm not at home." Suddenly, he laughed. "Wouldn't it be funny if Richard came here?" "And found you here, you mean?" They laughed, rolling in the bed like children. "I wonder what he'd think." Poor man. He wouldn't know what to think. They looked at each other and began to laugh again. "We certainly aren't giving him an awful lot of sympathy," Eric said. "That's true." Vivaldo sat up and lit 2 cigarettes, giving one to Eric. "The poor bastard must really be suffering. After all, he doesn't know what hit him." They were silent. And I'm sure Cass isn't laughing. No, not at Richard, not at anything. She sounded half out of her mind. Where was she calling from? Home. Richard had just gone out. I wonder if he really did go to my house. Maybe I should call and see if Ida's there. But he did not move toward the phone. It's all just about as messy as it can possibly be, Eric said after a moment. Richard's talking about suing for divorce and getting custody of the children. Yes, and he's probably gone out shopping for a brand with the letter A on it, and if he could, he'd arrange for Cass to peddle her ass in the streets and drop dead of syphilis, slowly, because the cat's been wounded, man, in his self-esteem. Well, said Eric slowly, he has been wounded. You haven't got to be admirable in order to feel pain. No. But I think that perhaps you can begin to become admirable if, when you're hurt, you don't try to pay back. He looked at Eric and put one hand on the back of Eric's neck. Do you know what I mean? Perhaps if you can accept the pain that almost kills you, you can use it. You can become better. Eric watched him, smiling a strange half-smile, with his face full of love and pain. That's very hard to do. One's got to try. I know, he said, very carefully, watching Vivaldo. Otherwise, you just get stopped with whatever it was that ruined you, and you make it happen over and over again, and your life is ceased, really, because you can't move or change or love anymore. Vivaldo let his hand fall. He leaned back. You're trying to tell me something. What is it you're trying to tell me? I was talking about myself. Maybe. But I don't believe you. I just hope, said Eric suddenly, that Cass will never hate me. Why should she hate you? I can't do her much good. I haven't done her much good. You don't know that. Cass knew what she was doing. I think she had a much clearer idea than you. Because you know, and he grinned. You aren't very clear-headed. I think I was hoping, perhaps we were hoping, that Richard would never find out and that Eve would get here before... Yes, well, life isn't ever that tidy. You're very clear-headed, Eric said. Naturally. He grinned and reached out and pulled Eric to him. And you must do the same for me, baby, when I'm in trouble. Be clear-headed. I'll do my best, said Eric gravely. Vivaldo laughed. No one could ever hate you. You're much too funny. He pulled away. What time are you meeting Cass? At 4? At the Museum of Modern Art. God. How's she going to get away? Or is Richard coming along? Eric hesitated. She isn't sure that Richard's coming back today. I see. I think maybe we'd better have a cup of coffee. I'm going to the John. And he leapt out of bed and slammed the bathroom door behind him. Eric walked into the kitchen, which was only slightly less disordered than he now felt himself to be, and put coffee on the stove. He stood there a moment, watching the blue flame in the gloom of the small room. He took down 2 coffee cups and found the milk and sugar. He returned to the big room and cleared the night table of books and of urgently scrawled notes, nearly all of which, beneath his eyes, as he wrote them on small scraps of paper, had hardened into irrelevance, and emptied the ashtray. He picked up his clothes and Vivaldo's from the floor, piling them on a chair, and straightened the sheets on the bed. He put the cups and the milk and sugar on the night table, discovered that there were only 5 cigarettes left, and searched in his pockets for more, but there were none. He was hungry, but the refrigerator was empty. He thought that perhaps he could find the energy to dress and run down to the corner delicatessen for something. Vivaldo was probably hungry too. He walked to the window and peeked out through the blinds. The rain poured down like a wall. It struck the pavements with a vicious sound and spattered in the swollen gutters with the force of bullets. The asphalt was wide and white and blank with rain. The gray pavements danced and gleamed and sloped. Nothing moved, Not a car, not a person, not a cat. And the rain was the only sound. He forgot about going to the store and merely watched the rain, comforted by the anonymity and the violence. This violence was also peace. And just as the speeding rain distorted, blurred, blunted, all the familiar outlines of walls, windows, doors, parked cars, lampposts, hydrants, trees, so Eric, now, in his silent watching, sought to blur and blunt and flee from all the conundrums which crowded in on him. "How will I ever get to the museum in all this rain?" he wondered. But he did not dare to wonder what he would say to Cass, what she would say to him. He thought of Eve, thought of him with a sorrow that was close to panic, feeling doubly faithless, feeling that the principal support of his life had shifted and would shift again, might fail beneath the dreadful, the accumulating and secret weight. Faintly, from the closed door behind him, he heard Vivaldo whistling. How could he not have known what he was capable of feeling for Vivaldo? And the answer drummed at him as relentlessly as the falling rain fell. He had not known because he had not dared to know. There were so many things one did not dare to know. And were they all patiently waiting, like demons in the dark, to spring from hiding, to reveal themselves on some rainy Sunday morning? He dropped the blind and turned back into the room. The telephone rang. He stared at it sourly, thinking, more revelations, and picked up the receiver. His agent, Harmon, shouted in his ear. "Hello there, Eric. I'm sorry to bother you on a Sunday morning, but you're a pretty hard man to reach. I was thinking of sending you a telegram." "Am I hard to find? I've just been staying home, it seems to me, curled up with that lovely script." "Don't shit me, sweetheart. I know you've got a hard-on for that play, but it's not that big. You just haven't been answering your phone. Listen." "Yes?" "About your screen test. You got a pencil?" "Wait a minute." He found a pencil on his desk and a scrap of paper and returned to the phone. "Go ahead, Harmon." "You're not going to the coast. It's fixed up for you to do it here. You know where the Allied Studios are?" "Yes, naturally." "Well, it's set for Wednesday morning. Allied at 10. Listen, can you have lunch with me tomorrow?" "Yes, I'd love to." "Good. I'll fill you in on all the details. Downey's okay?" "Right. What time?" 1 o'clock. Now, you still with me?" "All ears, baby." "Well, we finally got that Meshuggah of a broken-down movie star in town, and the rehearsal date is definitely set for a week from tomorrow." "Next week?" "Right." "Wonderful. God, I'll be so glad to be working again." Vivaldo came out of the bathroom, seeming unutterably huge in his blank, white nakedness, and walked into the kitchen. He looked critically at the coffee pot, came back into the room, and threw himself into the bed. "You're going to be working from now on, Eric. You're on your way, sweetheart. You're going to go right over the top, and baby, I couldn't be more delighted." "Thanks, Harmon. I certainly hope you're right." "I've been in the business longer than you've been in the world, Eric. I know a winner when I see one, and I've never made a mistake. Not about that. You be good now. I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye." "Goodbye." He put down the receiver, filled with a fugitive excitement. "Good news?" "That was my agent. We're going into rehearsal next week, and we're doing my screen test Wednesday." Then his triumph blazed up in him, and he turned to Vivaldo. "Isn't that fantastic?" Vivaldo watched him, smiling. "I think we ought to drink to that, baby." He watched as Eric picked up the empty bottle from the floor. "Ah, too sad." "But I've got a little bourbon," Eric said. "Crazy." Eric poured 2 bourbons and lowered the flame under the coffee. "Bourbon's really much more fitting," he said, happily, "since that's what they drink in the South, where I come from." He sat on the bed again, and they touched glasses. "To your first Oscar," said Vivaldo. Eric laughed. "That's touching." "To your Nobel Prize." "That's very touching." Eric pulled the sheet up to his navel. Vivaldo watched him. "You're going to be very lonely," he said suddenly. Eric looked over at Vivaldo and shrugged. "So will you, if it comes to that. If it comes to that," he added after a moment, "I'm lonely now." Vivaldo was silent for a moment. When he spoke, he sounded very sad and gentle. "Are you? Will you be? When your boy gets here?" Then Eric was silent. "No," he said finally. He hesitated. "Well, yes and no." Then he looked at Vivaldo. "Are you lonely with Ida?" Vivaldo looked down. "I've been thinking about that. Or I've been trying not to think about that all morning." He raised his eyes to Eric's. "I hope you don't mind me saying, well, hell, anyway, you know it, that I'm sort of hiding in your bed now. Hiding even in your arms, maybe. From Ida, in a way. I'm trying to get something straight in my mind about my life with Ida." He looked down again. "I keep feeling that it's up to me to resolve it, one way or another. But I don't seem to have the guts. I don't know how. I'm afraid to force anything because I'm afraid to lose her." He seemed to flounder in the depths of Eric's silence. "Do you know what I mean? Does it make any sense to you?" "Oh, yes," said Eric bleakly. "It makes sense, all right." He looked over at Vivaldo with a smile and dared to say, "Maybe at this very moment, while both of us are huddled here, hiding from things which frighten us, maybe you love me and I love you as well as we'll ever love or be loved in this world." Vivaldo said, "I don't know if I can accept that. Not yet. Not yet. As well, maybe. Well, surely." He looked up at Eric. "But it's not really, is it, very complete? Look, this day is almost over. How long will it be before such a day comes for us again? Because we're not kids. We know what life is like, and how time just vanishes, runs away. I can't really, like, from moment to moment, day to day, month to month, make you less lonely, or you me. We aren't driven in the same directions, and I can't help that, any more than you can." He paused, watching Eric with enormous, tormented eyes. He smiled. "It would be wonderful if it could be like that. You're very beautiful, Eric. But I don't really dig you the way I guess you must dig me, you know? And if we tried to arrange it, prolong it, control it, if we tried to take more than we've, by some miracle, I swear, stumbled on, then I'd just become a parasite and we both shrivel. So what can we really do for each other except just love each other and be each other's witness? And haven't we got the right to hope for more, so that we can really stretch into whoever we really are? Don't you think so?" And before Eric could answer, he took a large swallow of his whiskey and said in a different tone, a lower voice, "Because you know, when I was in the bathroom, I was thinking that, yes, I loved being in your arms, holding you." He flushed and looked up into Eric's face again. "Why not? It's warm, I'm sensual, I like you the way you love me, but," he looked down again, "it's not my battle, not my thing, and I know it, and I can't give up my battle. If I do, I'll die, and if I die," and now he looked up at Eric with a rueful, juvenile grin, "you won't love me anymore, and I want you to love me all my life." Eric reached out and touched Vivaldo's face. After a moment, Vivaldo grabbed his hand. "For you, the moon, baby," Eric said. His voice, to his surprise, was a grave, hoarse whisper. He cleared his throat. "Do you want some coffee now?" Vivaldo shook his head. He emptied his glass and put it on the table. "Drink up," he said to Eric. Eric finished his drink. Vivaldo took the glass from him and set it down. "I don't want any coffee now," he said. He opened his arms. "Let's make the most of our little day." By 10 minutes to 4, Eric was, somehow, showered, shaved, and dressed, with his raincoat and his rain cap on. The coffee was too hot. He only managed to drink half a cup. Vivaldo was still undressed. "You go on," he said. "I'll clean up a little and lock the door." "All right." But Eric dreaded leaving in the same way that Vivaldo dreaded getting dressed. "I'll leave you the cigarettes. I'll buy some." "That's big of you." "Go on now. Give my love to Cass." "Give my love," he said, "to Ida." They both grinned. "I'm going to call her," Vivaldo said. "Just as soon as you get your ass out of here." "Okay, I'm gone." Yet at the door, he stopped, looking at Vivaldo, who stood in the center of the room, holding a cup of coffee. He stared at the floor with a harsh bewilderment in his face. Then he felt Eric's eyes and looked up. He put down his coffee cup and walked to the door. He kissed Eric on the mouth and looked into his eyes. "See you soon, baby." "Yes," said Eric. "See you soon." He opened the door and left. Vivaldo listened to him go down the stairs. Then he walked to the window and opened the blinds and watched him. Eric appeared in the street as though he had been running, or as though he had been propelled. He looked first in one direction and then in the other. Then, his hands in his pockets, head lowered and shoulders raised, he walked the long block, hugging the sides of buildings. Vivaldo watched him till he turned the corner. Then he turned back into the room, pale with assessments, with guilt deliciously beginning to gnaw at the rope with which he had tied it, sharpening its teeth for him. And yet, at the same time, he felt radiantly, wonderfully spent. He poured himself another small drink and sat on the edge of the bed. Slowly, he dialed his number. The receiver was lifted almost at once, and Ida's voice came at him, with the force of an electric shock. "Hello?" In the background, he heard Billie Holiday singing Billy's Blues. "Hello, sugar. This is your man, checking on his woman." "Do you know what time it is? Where the hell are you?" "I'm at Eric's. We passed out here. I'm just pulling myself together." There was a peculiar relief in her voice. He was aware of it, because she tried to hide it. "You've been there all night? Ever since I left you?" "Yes. We came on over here and started talking and finished up Eric's whiskey. And he had quite a lot of whiskey. So, you see... Yes, I know you think it's against the law to stop drinking as long as there's anything left to drink. Listen, has Cass called?" "Yes." "Did you talk to her?" "No, Eric did." "Oh. What did Eric tell you?" "What do you mean, what did Eric tell me?" "I mean, what did Cass say?" "She said she was in trouble. Richards found out about them." "Isn't that awful?" "What else did she say?" "Well, I think that sort of cluttered up her mind. She doesn't seem to have said anything else. Did you know anything about all this?" "Yes. Richard was here. Has he been there?" "No." "Oh, Vivaldo, it was awful. I felt so sorry for him. I thought that you might be at Eric's, but I said you'd gone off to see your family in Brooklyn, and I didn't have the phone number or the address. It's very sad, Vivaldo. He's very bitter. He wants to hurt you. He feels that you betrayed him." "Yes, well, I think it may be easier for him to feel that way. How long was he there?" "Not long. Only about 10 minutes. But it seemed longer. He said some terrible things." "I'm sure. Does he still want to see me?" "I don't know." There was a pause. "Are you coming home now?" "Yes, right away." "Are you going to be there?" "I'll be here. Come on. Oh, where's Eric?" "He's gone uptown." "To meet Cass?" "Yes." She sighed. Lord, what a mess. Come on home, sweetie. If Richard's gonna shoot you, you don't want him to do it while you're wandering around Eric's house. That would really be too much. He laughed. You're right. You seem to be in a good mood today. I'm really in a terrible mood, but I'm being brave about it. I'm pretending to be Greer Garson. He laughed again. Does it help? Well, no, baby, but it makes everything pretty funny. All right. I'll be along in a minute. Okay, sweetie. Bye. Goodbye. He hung up with an exultant relief that no trouble seemed to be awaiting him at home with Ida. He felt that he had got away with something. He stepped into Eric's shower, scrubbed and sang. But when he stepped out, he realized he was terribly hungry and weak. While he was dressing, Eric's doorbell rang. He was sure that it was Richard, at last, and he hurriedly buckled his belt and pulled on his shoes before pressing the buzzer. He started, idiotically, to make up the bed, but realized that there would be no time, and, anyway, it could not possibly make any difference to Richard whether the bed was made or not. He waited, hearing the downstairs door open and close. He opened Eric's door, but he heard no footsteps. A voice called, "Eric Jones?" "Here," cried Vivaldo. He let out his breath. He walked to the landing. A Western Union boy came up the steps. "You Eric Jones?" "He's gone out, but I can take it." The boy handed him a telegram and a book for him to sign. He gave the boy 20 cents and walked back into the apartment. He thought that the telegram came, probably from Eric's agent or producer, but he looked at it more carefully and realized that it was a cable and that it came from Europe. He propped it against Eric's telephone. He scribbled a note. "I've borrowed your other raincoat. Note, cablegram." He paused. Then he scribbled, "It was a great day," and added, "Love, Vivaldo." He placed the note in the center of Eric's desk, weighting it down with an ink bottle. Then he was ready. He looked about the room. The bed was still unmade. He left it that way. The bottle was still on the floor, the glasses on the night table. Everything was absolutely still, silent, except for the rain. He looked again at the cablegram, which leaned lightly, charged, waiting, against the telephone. Telegrams always frightened him a little. He closed the door behind him, tested it to make certain that it was locked, and walked out, at last, into the unfriendly rain. Eric saw her at once, standing near the steps just beyond the ticket taker. She was pacing in a small circle, and her back, as he entered, was to him. She wore her loose brown raincoat, and her head was covered with a matching hood. And she played with the tip, white bone in the shape of a claw, of her thin umbrella. The museum was crowded, full of the stale Sunday museum stink, aggravated now by the damp. He came through the doors, behind a great cloud of windy, rainy, broad-beamed ladies. And they formed, before him, a large, loud, rocking wall as they shook their umbrellas and themselves and repeated to each other, in their triumphant voices, how awful the weather was. 3 young men and 2 young girls, scrubbed and milky, gleaming with their passion for improvement, and the ease with which they moved among abstractions, were surrendering their tickets and passing through the barrier. Others were on the steps, going down, coming up, stationary, peering at each other like half-blinded birds and setting up a hideous whir as of flying feathers and boastful wings. Cass, small, pale, and old-fashioned in her hood, restlessly pacing, disenchantedly watched all this. She glanced indifferently toward the resounding ladies, but did not see him. He was still trying to get through, or around, the wall. He looked toward the people on the steps again, wondering why Cass had wished to meet here. It was only too probable that these sacred and sterile halls contained, blocking a corridor or half hidden by a spinning mass of statuary, someone that they knew. Cass resignedly lit a cigarette, half turning in her small, imaginary cage. People now came crushing in through the doors behind him, and their greater pressure spat him past the ladies. He touched Cass on the shoulder. At his touch, she seemed to spring. Her eyes came alive at once, and her pale lips tensed. And her smile was pale. She said, "Oh, I thought you'd never get here." He had surmounted a desperate temptation not to come at all, and had half hoped that he would not find her there. She was so pale and seemed, in this cold, dazzling place, so helpless that his heart turned over. He was half an hour late. He said, "Dear Cass, please forgive me. It's hard to get anywhere in weather like this. How are you?" "Dead." She did not move, merely stared at the tip of her cigarette as though she were hypnotized by it. "I've had no sleep." Her voice was light and calm. "You picked a strange place for us to meet." "Did I?" She looked unseeingly around, then looked at him. The blank despair in her face seemed to take notice in the far distance of him, and her face softened into sorrow. "I guess I did. I just thought, well, nobody's likely to overhear us, and I just couldn't think of any other place." He had been about to suggest that they leave, but her white face and the fact of the rain checked him. "It's all right," he said. He took her arm. They started aimlessly up the steps. He realized that he was terribly hungry. "I can't stay with you very long, because I left the kids alone, but I told Richard that I was coming out, that I was going to try to see you today." They reached the first of a labyrinthine series of rooms, shifting and crackling with groups of people, with bright paintings above and around them, and stretching into the far distance, like tombstones with unreadable inscriptions. The people moved in waves, like tourists in a foreign graveyard. Occasionally, a single mourner, dreaming of some vanished relationship, stood alone in adoration or reverie before a massive memorial. But they mainly evinced, moving restlessly here and there, the democratic gaiety. Cass and Eric moved in some panic through this crowd, trying to find a quieter place, through fields of French Impressionists and Cubists and cacophonous modern masters, into a smaller room dominated by an enormous painting, executed, principally, in red, before which two students, a girl and a boy, stood holding hands. "Was it very bad, Cass, last night?" He asked this in a low voice as they stood before a painting in cool yellow, of a girl with a long neck, in a yellow dress, with yellow hair. "Yes." Her hood obscured her face. It was hot in the museum. She threw the hood back. Her hair was disheveled on the brow and trailing at the neck. She looked weary and old. "At first it was awful because I hadn't realized how much I'd hurt him. He can suffer, after all." And she looked at Eric quickly and looked away. They moved away from the yellow painting and faced another one, of a street with canals, somewhere in Europe. "And, no matter what has happened since, I did love him very much. He was my whole life, and he'll always be very important to me." She paused. "I suppose he made me feel terribly guilty. I didn't know that would happen. I didn't think it could, but it did." She paused again, her shoulders sagging with a weary and proud defeat. Then she touched his hand. "I hate to tell you that, but I must try to tell you all of it. He frightened me, too. He frightened me because I was suddenly terribly afraid of losing the children, and I cannot live without them." She moved one hand over her brow, uselessly pushing up her hair. "I didn't have to tell him. He didn't really know. He didn't suspect you at all, of course. He thought it was Vivaldo. I told him because I thought he had a right to know, that if we were going to continue together, we could begin again on a new basis, with everything clear between us. But I was wrong. Some things cannot be clear." The boy and girl were coming to their side of the room. Cass and Eric crossed over to stand beneath the red painting. "Or perhaps some things are clear, only one won't face those things. I don't know." Anyway, I didn't think he'd threaten me. I didn't think he'd try to frighten me. If he were leaving me, if he were being unfaithful to me, unfaithful, what a word. I don't think I'd try to hold him that way. I don't think I'd try to punish him. After all, he doesn't belong to me. Nobody belongs to anybody. They began walking again, down a long corridor, toward the ladies. He said these terrible things to me. He said that he would sue me for divorce and take Paul and Michael away from me, and I listened to him. It didn't seem real. I didn't see how he could say those things if he ever loved me, and I watched him. I could see that he was just saying these things to hurt me because he'd been hurt, like a child. And I saw that I'd loved him like that, like a child, and now the bill for all that dreaming had come in. How can one have dreamed so long? And I thought it was real. Now, I don't know what's real. And I felt betrayed. I feel that I'd betrayed myself, and you, and everything of value, everything any way that one aspires to become. One doesn't want to be simply another gray, shapeless monster. They passed the cheerful ladies, and Cass looked at them with wonder and with hatred. Oh, God, it's a miserable world. He said nothing, for he did not know what to say, and they continued their frightening promenade through the icy and angular jungle. The colors on the walls blared at them like frozen music. He had the feeling that these rooms would never cease folding in on each other, that this labyrinth was eternal, and a sorrow entered him for Cass, stronger than any love he had ever felt for her. She stood as erect as a soldier, moving straight ahead, and no bigger, as they said in the South, than a minute. He wished that he could rescue her, that it was within his power to rescue her and make her life less hard. But it was only love which could accomplish the miracle of making a life bearable. Only love, and love itself mostly failed. And he had never loved her. He had used her to find out something about himself, and even this was not true. He had used her in the hope of avoiding a confrontation with himself which he had, nevertheless, and with a vengeance, been forced to endure. He felt as far removed from Cass now, in her terrible hour, as he was physically removed from Eve. Space howled between them like a flood. And whereas, with every moment now, Eve was coming closer, defeating all that water, and, as he approached, becoming more unreal, Cass was being driven farther away, was already in the unconquerable distance, where she would be wrapped about by reality, unalterable forever, as a corpse is wrapped in a shroud. Therefore, his sorrow, now that he was helpless, luxuriously stretched and reached. "You'll never be a monster," he said. "Never. What's happening is unspeakable, I know, but it can't defeat you. You can't go under. You've come too far. I think I know what I won't be, but what I'm going to become, that I don't see at all, and I'm afraid." They passed not far from a weary guard, who looked blinded and dazzled, as though he had never been able to escape the light. Before them was a large and violent canvas in greens and reds and blacks, in blocks and circles, in dagger-like exclamations. It took a flying leap, as it were, from the wall, poised for the spectator's eyeballs, and at the same time it seemed to stretch endlessly and adoringly in on itself, reaching back into an unspeakable chaos. It was aggressively and superbly uncharming and unreadable, and might have been painted by a lonely and bloodthirsty tyrant who had been cheated of his victims. "How horrible," Cass murmured. But she did not move, for they had this corner, except for the guard, to themselves. "You said once," he said, "that you wanted to grow. Isn't that always frightening? Doesn't it always hurt?" It was a question he was asking himself, of course. She turned toward him with a small, grateful smile, then turned to the painting again. "I'm beginning to think," she said, that growing just means learning more and more about anguish. That poison becomes your diet. You drink a little of it every day. Once you've seen it, you can't stop seeing it. That's the trouble. And it can. She passed her hand wearily over her brow again. Drive you mad. She walked away briefly, then returned to their corner. You begin to see that you yourself, innocent, upright you, have contributed and do contribute to the misery of the world, which will never end, because we're what we are. He watched her face, from which the youth was now, before his eyes, departing. Her girlhood, at last, was falling away from her. Yet her face did not seem precisely faded, or, for that matter, old. It looked scoured. There was something invincibly impersonal in it. I watched Richard this morning, and I thought to myself, as I've thought before, how much responsibility I must take for who he is, for what he's become. She put the tip of her finger against her lips for a moment, and closed her eyes. I score him, after all, for being second-rate, for not having any real passion, any real daring, any real thoughts of his own. But he never did. He hasn't changed. I was delighted to give him my opinions. When I was with him, I had the daring and the passion, and he took them all, of course. How could he tell they weren't his? And I was happy because I'd succeeded so brilliantly, I thought, in making him what I wanted him to be. And of course he can't understand that it's just that triumph which is intolerable now. I've made myself less than I might have been by leading him to water which he doesn't know how to drink. It's not for him, but it's too late now. She smiled. He doesn't have any real work to do. That's his trouble. That's the trouble with this whole unspeakable time and place. And I'm trapped. It doesn't do any good to blame the people or the time. One is oneself, all those people. We are the time. You think there isn't any hope for us? Hope? The words seemed to bang from wall to wall. Hope? No, I don't think there's any hope. We're too empty here. Her eyes took in the Sunday crowd. Too empty. Here. She touched her heart. This isn't a country at all. It's a collection of football players and Eagle Scouts. Cowards. We think we're happy. We're not. We're doomed. She looked at her watch. I must get back. She looked at him. I only wanted to see you for a moment. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. I'll let you know when I do. Richard's gone off. He may not be back for a couple of days. He wants to think, he says. She sighed. I don't know, she said, carefully looking at the painting. I imagine, for the sake of the children, he'll decide that we should weather this and stick together. I don't know if I want that or not. I don't know if I can bear it. But he won't sue me for divorce. He hasn't got the courage to name you as correspondent. Each, to the other's astonishment, laughed. She looked at him again. I can't come to you, she said. There was a silence. No, he said. You can't come to me. So it's really, though I'll see you again. Goodbye. Yes, he said. Then, it had to come. I know. I wish it hadn't come as it has come, but, she smiled. You did something very valuable for me, Eric, just the same. I hope you'll believe me. I hope you'll never forget it. What I've said. I'll never forget you. No, he said, and suddenly touched her arm. He felt that he was falling out of the world. Cass was releasing him into chaos. He held on to her for the last time. She looked into his face, and she said, Don't be frightened, Eric. It will help me not to be frightened, if you're not. Do that for me." She touched his face, his lips. "Be a man. It can be born. Everything can be born." "Yes." But he stared at her still. "Oh, Cass, if only I could do more." "You can't," she said, "do more than you've done. You've been my lover, and now you're my friend." She took his hand in hers and stared down at it. "That was you gave me for a little while. It was really you." They turned away from the ringing canvas into the crowds again and walked slowly down the stairs. Cass put up her hood. He had never taken off his cap. "When will I see you?" he asked. "Will you call me or what?" "I'll call you," she said. "Tomorrow or the day after." They walked to the doors and stopped. It was still raining. They stood watching the rain. No one entered, no one left. Then a cab rolled up to the curb and stopped. Two women, wearing plastic hoods, fumbled with their umbrellas and handbags and change purses, preparing to step out of the cab. Without a word, Eric and Cass rushed out into the rain, to the curb. The women ran heavily into the museum. Eric opened the cab door. "Goodbye, Eric." She leaned forward and kissed him. He held her. Her face was wet, but he did not know whether it was rainwater or tears. She pulled away and got into the cab. "I'll be expecting your call," he said. "Yes, I'll call you. Be good. God bless you, Cass. So long." "So long." He closed the door on her, and the cab moved away, down the long, blank, shining street. Darkness was beginning to fall. The lights of the city would soon begin to blaze. It would not be long now before these lights would carry his name. An errant wind, a cold wind, ruffled the water in the gutter at Eric's feet. Then everything was still, with a bleakness that was almost comforting. Ida heard Vivaldo's step and rushed to open the door for him, just as he began fumbling for his key. She threw back her head and laughed. "You look like you narrowly escaped a lynching, Dad. And where did you get that coat?" She looked him up and down and laughed again. "Come on in, you poor drowned rat, before the posse gets here." She closed the door behind him, and he took off Eric's coat and hung it in the bathroom and dried his dripping hair. "Do we have anything to eat in this house?" "Yes. Are you hungry?" "Starving." He came out of the bathroom. "What did Richard have to say?" She was in the kitchen with her back to him, digging in the cupboard beneath the sink where the pots and pans were kept. She came up with a frying pan, looked at him briefly, and this look made him feel that Richard had managed, somehow, to frighten her. "Nothing very pleasant, but it's not important now." She put the pan on the stove and opened the icebox door. "I think you and Cass were his whole world, and now both of you have treated him so badly that he doesn't know where he is." She took tomatoes and lettuce and a package of pork chops out of the icebox and put them on the table. "He tried to make me angry, but I just felt terribly sad. He'd been so hurt." She paused. Men are so helpless when they're hurt. He came up behind her and kissed her. "Are they?" She returned his kiss and said gravely, "Yes. You don't believe it's happening. You think that there must have been some mistake." "How wise you are," he said. "I'm not wise. I'm just a poor, ignorant black girl trying to get along." He laughed. "If you're just a poor, ignorant black girl trying to get along, I'd sure hate like hell to tangle with one who'd made it. But you wouldn't know. You think women tell the truth. They don't. They can't." She stepped away from him, busy with another saucepan and water and flame, and she gave him a mocking look. "Men wouldn't love them if they did." "You just don't like men." She said, "I can't say that I've met very many." Not what I call men. I hope I'm one of them. Oh, there's hope for you, she said humorously. You might make it yet. That's probably, he said, the nicest thing you've ever said to me. She laughed, but there was something sad and lonely in the sound. There was something sad and lonely in her whole aspect, which obscurely troubled him, and he began to watch her closely, without quite knowing that he was doing so. She said, Poor Vivaldo. I've given you a hard time, haven't I, baby? I'm not complaining, he said carefully. No, she said, half to herself, running her fingers thoughtfully through a bowl of dry rice. I'll say that much for you. I dish it out, but you sure as hell can take it. You think maybe, he said, that I take too much? She frowned. She dumped the rice into the boiling water. Maybe. Hell, I don't think women know what they want. Not a damn one of them. Look at Cass. Do you want a drink? She asked suddenly. Before dinner? Sure. He took down the bottle and the glasses and took out the ice. What do you mean? Women don't know what they want. Don't you know what you want? She had taken down the great salad bowl and was slicing tomatoes into it. It seemed that she did not dare be still. Sure, I thought I did. I was sure once. Now I'm not so sure. She paused. And I only found that out last night. She looked up at him humorously, gave a little shrug, and sliced savagely into another tomato. He set her drink beside her. What's happened to confuse you? She laughed. Again he heard that striking melancholy. Living with you? Would you believe it? I fell for that jive. He dragged his work stool in from the other room and teetered on it, watching her a little above her. What jive, sweetheart, are you talking about? She sipped her drink. That love jive, sweetheart. Love, love, love. His heart jumped up. They watched each other. She smiled a rueful smile. Are you trying to tell me, without my having to ask you or anything, that you love me? Am I? I guess I am. Then she dropped the knife and sat perfectly still, looking down, the fingers of one hand drumming on the table. Then she clasped her hands, the fingers of one hand playing with the ruby-eyed snake ring, slipping it half off, slipping it on. But that's wonderful. He took her hand. It lay cold and damp and lifeless in his. A kind of wind of terror shook him for an instant. Isn't it? It makes me very happy. You make me very happy. She took his hand and rested her cheek against it. Do I, Vivaldo? Then she rose and walked to the sink to wash the lettuce. He followed her, standing beside her, and looking into her closed, averted face. What's the matter, Ida? He put one hand on her waist. She shivered, as if in revulsion, and he let his hand fall. Tell me, please. It's nothing, she said, trying to sound light about it. I told you, I'm in a bad mood. It's probably the time of the month. Now, come on, baby, don't try to cop out that way. She was tearing the lettuce and washing it and placing it in a towel. She continued with this in silence until she had torn off the last leaf. She was trying to avoid his eyes. He had never seen her at such a loss before. Again, he was frightened. What is it? Leave me alone, Vivaldo. We'll talk about it later. We will not talk about it later. We'll talk about it now. The rice came to a boil, and she moved hastily away from him to turn down the flame. My mama always told me, honey, you can't cook and talk. Well, stop cooking. She gave him that look, coquettish, wide-eyed and amused, which he had known so long. But now there was something desperate in it. Had there always been something desperate in this look? But you said you were hungry. Stop that. It's not funny, okay? He led her to the table. I want to know what's happening. Is it something Richard said? I am not trying to be funny. I would like to feed you. Then, with a sudden burst of anger, it's got nothing to do with Richard. What, after all, can Richard say? He had had some wild idea that Richard had made up a story about himself and Eric, and he had been on the point of denying it. He recovered, hoping that she had not been aware of his panic, but his panic increased. He said, very gently, Well then, what is it, Ida? She said, wearily, Oh, it's too many things. It goes too far back. I can never make you understand it. Never. Try me. You say you love me. Why can't you trust me? She laughed. Oh, you think life is so simple. She looked up at him and laughed again. And this laughter was unbearable. He wanted to strike her, not in anger, only to make the laughter stop. But he forced himself to stand still and did nothing. Because I know you're older than I am. I always think of you as being much younger. I always think of you as being a very nice boy who doesn't know what the score is, who'll maybe never find out. And I don't want to be the one to teach you. She said the last in a venomous undertone, looking down again at her hands. Okay. Go on. Go on? She looked up at him in a strange, wild way. You want me to go on? He said, Please stop tormenting me, Ida. Please, go on. Am I tormenting you? You want it in writing? Her face changed. She rose from the table and walked back to the stove. I'm sure it must seem like that to you, she said, very humbly. She moved to the sink and leaned against it, watching him. But I wasn't trying to torment you. Whenever I did, I don't think that I thought about that at all. In fact, I know I didn't. I've never had the time. She watched his face. I've just realized lately that I've bitten off more than I can chew, certainly more than I can swallow. He winced. She broke off suddenly. Are you sure you're a man, Vivaldo? He said, I've got to be sure. Fair enough, she said. She walked to the stove and put a light under the frying pan, walked to the table and opened the meat. She began to dust it with salt and pepper and paprika, and chopped garlic into it, near the bone. He took a swallow of his drink, which had no taste whatever. He splashed more whiskey into his glass. When Rufus died, something happened to me, she said. She sounded now very quiet and weary, as though she were telling someone else's story, also as though she herself, with a faint astonishment, were hearing it for the first time. But it was yet more astonishing that he now began to listen to a story he had always known, but never dared believe. I can't explain it. Rufus had always been the world to me. I loved him. So did I, he said, too quickly, irrelevantly, and for the first time it occurred to him that, possibly, he was a liar, had never loved Rufus at all, but had only feared and envied him. I don't need your credentials, Vivaldo, she said. She watched the frying pan critically, waiting for it to become hot enough, then dropped in a little oil. The point, anyway, at the moment, is that I loved him. He was my big brother. But as soon as I knew anything, I knew that I was stronger than he was. He was nice. He was really very nice, no matter what any of you might have thought of him later. None of you, anyway, knew anything about him. You didn't know how. You often say that, he said wearily. Why? How could you? How can you? Dreaming the way you dream? You people think you're free. That means you think you've got something other people want or need. Shit. She grinned wryly and looked at him. And you do, in a way. But it isn't what you think it is. And you're going to find out, too. just as soon as some of those other people start getting what you've got now." She shook her head. "I feel sorry for them. I feel sorry for you. I even feel kind of sorry for myself, because God knows I've often wished you'd left me where I was." "Down in the jungle?" he taunted. "Yes, down there in the jungle, black and funky, and myself." His small anger died down as quickly as it had flared up. "Well," he said quietly, "sometimes I'm nostalgic too, Ida." He watched her dark, lonely face. For the first time, he had an intimation of how she would look when she grew old. "What I've never understood," he said finally, "is that you always accuse me of making a thing about your color, of penalizing you. But you do the same thing. You always make me feel white. Don't you think that hurts me? You lock me out, and all I want is for you to be a part of me, for me to be a part of you. I wouldn't give a damn if you were striped like a zebra." She laughed. "Yes, you would, really. But you say the cutest things. Then, if I lock you out, as you put it, it's mainly to protect you." "Protect me from what? And I don't want to be protected. Besides, I don't believe you. I don't believe that's why. You want to protect yourself. You want to hate me because I'm white, because it's easier for you that way." "I don't hate you." "Then why do you always bring it up? What is it?" She stirred the rice, which was almost ready, found a colander, and placed it in the sink. Then she turned to face him. "This all began because I said that you people—" "Listen to yourself! You people!" "Didn't know anything about Rufus. Because we're white. No, because he was black. Oh, I give up. And anyway, why must we always end up talking about Rufus?" "I had started to tell you something," she said quietly, and watched him. He swallowed some more of his whiskey and lit a cigarette. "True. Please, go on." "Because I'm black," she said after a moment, and sat at the table near him. "I know more about what happened to my brother than you can ever know. I watched it happen from the beginning. I was there. He shouldn't have ended up the way he did. That's what's been so hard for me to accept. He was a very beautiful boy. Most people aren't beautiful. I knew that right away. I watched them, and I knew. But he didn't, because he was so much nicer than I." She paused, and the silence grumbled with the sound of the frying pan and the steady sound of the rain. "He loved our father, for example. He really loved him. I didn't. He was just a loud-mouthed, broken-down man who liked to get drunk and hang out in barber shops. Well, maybe he didn't like it, but that was all he could find to do, except work like a dog for nothing, and play the guitar on the weekends for his only son." She paused again, smiling. "There was something very nice about those weekends, just the same. I can still see Daddy, his belly hanging out, strumming on that guitar and trying to teach Rufus some down-home song, and Rufus grinning at him and making fun of him a little, really, but very nicely, and singing with him. I bet my father was never happier all the days of his life than when he was singing for Rufus. He's got no one to sing to now. He was so proud of him. He bought Rufus his first set of drums." She was not locking him out now. He felt, rather, that he was being locked in. He listened, seeing, or trying to see, what she saw, and feeling something of what she felt. But he wondered, just the same, how much her memory had filtered out. And he wondered what Rufus must have looked like in those days, with all his bright, untried brashness, and all his hopes intact. She was silent for a moment, leaning forward, looking down, her elbows on her knees, and the fingers of one hand restlessly playing with her ring. "When Rufus died, all the light went out of that house. All of it. That was why I couldn't stay there. I knew I couldn't stay there. I'd grow old like they were, suddenly. and I'd end up like all the other abandoned girls who can't find anyone to protect them. I'd always known I couldn't end up like that. I'd always known it. I'd counted on Rufus to get me out of there. I knew he'd do anything in the world for me, just like I would for him. It hadn't occurred to me that it wouldn't happen. I knew it would happen. She rose and returned to the stove and took the rice off the fire and poured it into the colander and ran water over it, put water in the saucepan and put it back on the fire, placing the colander on top of it and covering the rice with a towel. She turned the chops over. Then she sat down. When we saw Rufus's body, I can't tell you. My father stared at it. He stared at it and stared at it. It didn't look like Rufus. It was terrible. From the water, and he must have struck something going down or in the water because he was so broken and lumpy and ugly. My brother and my father stared at it, and he said, "They don't leave a man much, do they?" His own father was beaten to death with a hammer by a railroad guard, and they brought his father home like that. My mother got frightened. She wanted my father to pray, and he shouted it at the top of his lungs. Pray? Who pray? I bet you if I ever get anywhere near that white devil you call God, I'll tear my son and my father out of his white hide. Don't you never say the word pray to me again, woman, not if you want to live. Then he started to cry. I'll never forget it. Maybe I hadn't loved him before, but I loved him then. That was the last time he ever shouted. He hasn't raised his voice since. He just sits there. He doesn't even drink anymore. Sometimes he goes out and listens to those fellows who make speeches on 125th Street and 7th Avenue. He says he just wants to live long enough. Long enough, Vivaldo said, to break the silence which abruptly roared around them. To be paid back? Yes, she said. And I felt that way too. She walked over to the stove again. I felt that I'd been robbed, and I had been robbed of the only hope I had, by a group of people too cowardly even to know what they had done, and it didn't seem to me that they deserved any better than what they'd given me. I didn't care what happened to them, just so they suffered. I didn't really much care what happened to me, but I wasn't going to let what happened to Rufus and what was happening all around me happen to me. I was going to get through the world and get what I needed out of it, no matter how. He thought, oh, it's coming now, and felt a strange, bitter relief. He finished his drink and lit another cigarette and watched her. She looked over at him as though to make certain that he was still listening. Nothing you've said so far, he said carefully, seems to have much to do with being black, except for what you make out of it. But nobody can help you there. She sighed sharply in a kind of rage. That could be true, but it's too easy for you to say that. Ida, a lot of what you've had to say ever since we met has been too easy. He watched her. Hasn't it? And then, sweetheart, suffering doesn't have a color, does it? Can't we step out of this nightmare? I'd give anything if we could. He crossed to her and took her in his arms. Please, Ida, whatever has to be done to set us free, let's do that. Her eyes were full of tears. She looked down. Let me finish my story. Nothing you say will make any difference. You don't know that. Are you afraid? He stepped back. No. Then, yes. Yes. I can't take any more of your revenge. Well, I can't either. Let me finish. Come away from the stove. I can't eat now. Everything will be ruined. Let it be ruined. Come and sit down. He wished that he were better prepared for this moment, that he had not been with Eric, that his hunger would vanish, that his fear would drop, and love lend him a transcendent perception and concentration. But he knew himself to be physically weak and tired, not drunk, but far from sober. Part of his troubled mind was far away, gorging on the conundrum of himself. She put out the fire under the frying pan and came and sat at the table. He pushed her drink toward her, but she did not touch it. I knew there wasn't any hope uptown. A lot of those men, they got their little deals going and all that, but they don't really have anything. Mr. Charlie's not going to let them get but so far. Those that really do have something would never have any use for me. I'm too dark for them. They see girls like me on 7th Avenue every day. I knew what they would do to me. And now he knew that he did not want to hear the rest of her story. He thought of himself on 7th Avenue. Perhaps he had never left. He thought of the day behind him, of Eric and Cass and Richard, and felt himself now being sucked into the rapids of a mysterious defeat. There was only one thing for me to do, as Rufus used to say, and that was to hit the A-train. So I hit it. Nothing was clear in my mind at first. I used to see the way white men watched me, like dogs, and I thought about what I could do to them, how I hated them, the way they looked, and the things they'd say, all dressed up in their damn white skin and their clothes just so, and their little weak white pricks jumping in their drawers. You could do any damn thing with them if you just led them along, because they wanted to do something dirty, and they knew that you knew how. All black people knew that. Only the polite ones didn't say dirty. They said real. I used to wonder what in the world they did in bed, white people I mean, between themselves, to get them so sick. Because they are sick. And I'm telling you something that I know. I had a couple of girlfriends, and we used to go out every once in a while with some of these shitheads. But they were smart, too. They knew that they were white, and they could always go back home, and there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. I thought to myself, shit, this scene is not for me. Because I didn't want their little change. I didn't want to be at their mercy. I wanted them to be at mine. She sipped her drink. Well, you were calling me all the time about that time, but I didn't really think about you very much, not seriously anyway. I liked you, but I certainly hadn't planned to get hung up on a white boy who didn't have any money. In fact, I hadn't planned to get hung up on anybody. But I liked you, and the few times I saw you, it was a kind of relief from all those other horrible people. You were really nice to me. You didn't have that look in your eyes. You just acted like a real sweet boy, and maybe, without knowing it, I got to depend on it. Sometimes I'd just see you for a minute or so. We'd just have a cup of coffee or something like that, and I'd run off, but I felt better. I was kind of protected from their eyes and their hands. I was feeling so sick most of the time through there. I didn't want my father to know what I was doing, and I tried not to think about Rufus. That was when I decided that I ought to try to sing. I'd do it for Rufus, and then all the rest wouldn't matter. I would have settled the score. But I thought I needed somebody to help me, and it was then, just at that time, that She stopped and looked down at her hands. I think I wanted to go to bed with you. Not to have an affair with you, but just to go to bed with somebody that I liked. Somebody who wasn't old, because all those men are old, no matter how young they are. I'd only been to bed with one boy I liked, a boy on our block, but he got religion, and so it all stopped, and he got married. And there weren't any other colored men, I was afraid, because look what happened to them. They got cut down like grass. And I didn't see any way out, except, finally, you and Ellis. Then she stopped. They listened to the rain. He had finished his drink, and he picked up hers. She looked down. He had the feeling that she could not look up, and he was afraid to touch her. And the silence stretched. He longed for it to end, and dreaded it. There was nothing he could say. She straightened her shoulders and reached out for a cigarette. He lit it for her. Richard knows about me and Ellis, she said in a matter-of-fact tone. But that's not why I'm telling you. I'm telling you because I'm trying to bring this whole awful thing to a halt, if that's possible. She paused. She said, "Let me have a sip of your drink, please." "It's yours," he said. He gave it to her and poured himself another one. She blew a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "It's funny the way things work. If it hadn't been for you, I don't think Ellis would ever have got so hung up on me. He saw, better than I did, that I really liked you, and that meant that I could really like somebody, and so why not him, since he could give me so much more? And I thought so too, that it was a kind of dirty trick for life to play on me, for me to like you better than I liked him. And, after all, the chances of its lasting were just about equal, only with him, if I played it right, I might have something to show for it when it was all over. And he was smart. He didn't bug me about it. He said, sure, he wanted me, but he was going to help me regardless, and the one thing had nothing to do with the other. And he did. He was very nice to me in his way. He was as good as his word. He was nicer to me than anyone had ever been before. He used to take me out to dinner, to places where nobody would know him or where it wouldn't matter if they did. A lot of the time we went up to Harlem, or if he knew I was sitting in somewhere, he'd drop in. He didn't seem to be trying to hype me, not even when he talked about his wife and his kids. You know? He sounded as though he really was lonely. And after all, I owed him a lot. And it was nice to be treated that way and to know the cat had enough money to take you anywhere and... well, it started. I guess I'd always known it was going to start, and then, once it started, I didn't think I could stand it, but I didn't know how to stop it. Because it's one thing for a man to be doing all these things for you while you're not having an affair with him, and it's another thing for him to be doing them after you've stopped having an affair with him. And I had to go on. I had to get up there on top, where maybe I could begin to breathe. But I saw why he'd never been upset about you. He really is smart. He was glad I was with you. He told me so. He was glad I had another boyfriend because it made it easier for him. It meant I wouldn't make any scenes. I wouldn't think I'd fallen in love with him. It gave him another kind of power over me, in a way, because he knew that I was afraid of your finding out, and the more afraid I got, the harder it was to refuse him. Do you understand that? Yes, he said slowly. I think I understand that. They stared at each other. She dropped her eyes. But, you know, she said slowly, I think you knew all the time. He said nothing. She persisted in a low voice. Didn't you? You told me that you weren't, he said. But did you believe me? He stammered. I had to believe you. Why? Again, he said nothing. Because you were afraid? Yes, he said at last. I was afraid. It was easier to let it happen than to try to stop it? Yes. Why? Her eyes searched his face. It was his turn to look away. I used to hate you for that sometimes, she said. For pretending to believe me because you didn't want to know what was happening to me. I was trying to do what I thought you wanted. I was afraid that you would leave me. You told me that you would. He rose and stalked the kitchen, his hands in his pockets, water standing in his eyes. I worried about it. I thought about it. But I put it out of my mind. You had made it a matter of my trusting you. Don't you remember? He looked at her with hatred, standing above her, but she seemed to be beyond his anger. Yes, I remember. But you didn't start trusting me. You just gave in to me and pretended to trust me. What would you have done if I had called you on it? I don't know. But if you had faced it, I would have had to face it. As long as you were pretending, I had to pretend. I'm not blaming you. I'm just telling it to you like it is. She looked up at him. I saw that it could go on a long time like that, and her lips twisted wearily. I sort of had you where I wanted you. I'd got my revenge. Only, it wasn't you I was after. It wasn't you I was trying to beat. It was Ellis? She sighed and put one hand to her face. Oh, I don't know. I really don't know what I was thinking. Sometimes I'd leave Ellis and I'd come and find you here, like my dog or my cat, I used to think sometimes, just waiting. And I'd be afraid you'd be here, and I'd be afraid you'd gone out, afraid you'd ask me, really ask me where I'd been, and afraid you wouldn't. Sometimes you'd try, but I could always stop you. I could see in your eyes when you were frightened. I hated that look, and I hated me, and I hated you. I could see how white men got that look they so often had when they looked at me. Somebody had beat the shit out of them, had scared the shit out of them long ago. And now I was doing it to you. And it made it hard for me when you touched me, especially. She stopped, picked up her drink, tasted it, set it down. I couldn't stand Ellis. You don't know what it's like to have a man's body over you if you can't stand that body. And it was worse now, since I'd been with you, than it had ever been before. Before, I used to watch them wriggle and listen to them grunt, and, God, they were so solemn about it, sweating yellow pigs and so vain, like that sad little piece of meat was making miracles happen. And I guess it was for them, and I wasn't touched at all. I just wished I could make them come down lower. Oh, yes, I found out all about white people. That's what they were like, alone, where only a black girl could see them, and the black girl might as well have been blind as far as they were concerned, because they knew they were white, baby, and they ruled the world. But now it was different. Sometimes when Ellis put his hands on me, it was all I could do not to scream, not to vomit. It had got to me. It had got to me, and I felt that I was being pumped full of, I don't know what, not poison exactly, but dirt, waste, filth. And I'd never be able to get it out of me, never be able to get that stink out of me. And sometimes, she covered her mouth. Her tears spilled down over her hand, over the red ring. He could not move. Oh, Lord Jesus, I've done terrible things. Oh, Lord, sometimes. And then I'd come home to you. He always had that funny little smile when I finally left him. That smile he has. I've seen it many times now. When he's outsmarted somebody who doesn't know it yet. He can't help it. That's him. It was as though he was saying, now that I'm through with you, have a nice time with Vivaldo. And give him my regards. And funny. I couldn't hate him. I saw what he was doing, but I couldn't hate him. I wondered what it felt like to be like that, not to have any real feelings at all, except to say, well, now, let's do this, and now let's do that, and now let's eat, and now let's fuck, and now let's go. And do that all your life. And then I'd come home and look at you. But I'd bring him with me. But it was as though I was dirty, and you had to wash me each time. And I knew you never could, no matter how hard we tried. And I didn't hate him, but I hated you. And I hated me. Why didn't you stop it, Ida? You could have stopped it. You didn't have to go on with it. Stop it and go where? Stop it and do what? No, I thought to myself, well, you're in it now, girl. Close your eyes and grit your teeth and get through it. It'll be worth it when it's over. And that's why I've been working so hard. To get away. And what about me? What about us? She looked up at him with a bitter smile. What about us? I hoped I'd get through this, and then we'd see. But last night something happened. I couldn't take it anymore. We were up at Small's Paradise last night. You and Ellis? Yes, and Cass. Cass? I asked her to come and have a drink with me. Did you leave together? No. So that's why she got in late last night. He looked at her. It's a good thing I didn't come home then, isn't it? What would you have done, she cried, if you had? You'd have sat at that typewriter for a while, and then you'd have played some music, and you'd have gone out and got drunk. And when I came home, no matter when I came home, you'd have believed any lie I told you because you were afraid not to. "What a bitch you are," he said. "Yes," she said, with a terrible sobriety. "I know." She lit a cigarette. The hand that held the match trembled. "But I'm trying not to be. I don't know if there's any hope for me or not." She dropped the match on the table. "He made me sing with the band. They didn't really want me to, and I didn't want to, but they didn't want to say no to him. So I sang. And of course, I knew some of the musicians, and some of them had known Rufus. Baby, if musicians don't want to work with you, they sure can't make you know it. I sang Sweet Georgia Brown and something else. I wanted to get off that stand in the worst way. When it was over and the people were clapping, the bass player whispered to me. He said, 'You black white man's whore. Don't you never let me catch you on 7th Avenue, you hear? I'll tear your little black pussy up.' And the other musicians could hear him, and they were grinning. I'm gonna do it twice. Once for every black man you castrate every time you walk, and once for your poor brother, because I love that stud. And he gonna thank me for it, too. You can bet on that, black girl." And he slapped me on the ass, hard. Everybody could see it. And, you know, those people up there aren't fools. And before I could get away, he grabbed my hand and raised it, and he said, "She's the champion, ain't she, folks? Talk about walking, this girl ain't started walking." And he dropped my hand hard, like it was too hot or too dirty, and I almost fell off the stand. And everybody laughed and cheered. They knew what he meant, and I did too. And I got back to the table. Ellis was grinning like it was all a big joke, and it was, on me. She rose and poured herself a fresh drink. Then he took me to that place he has, way over on the East River. I kept wondering what I was going to do. I didn't know what to do. I watched his face in the taxicab. He put his hand on my leg, and he tried to take my hand, but I couldn't move. I kept thinking of what that black man had said to me, and his face when he said it. And I kept thinking of Rufus, and I kept thinking of you. It was like a merry-go-round. All these faces just kept going around in my mind, and a song kept going around in my head. "Oh, Lord, is it I?" And there he sat next to me, puffing on his cigar. The funny thing was that I knew if I really started crying or pleading, he'd take me home. He can't stand scenes. But I couldn't even do that. And God knows I wanted to get home. I hoped you wouldn't be here so I could just crawl under the sheets and die. And that way, when you came home, I could tell you everything before you came to bed. And maybe... But no, we were going to his place, and I felt that I deserved it. I felt that I couldn't fall much lower. I might as well go all the way and get it over with. And then we'd see if there was anything left of me after that. We'd see. She threw down about 2 fingers of whiskey and immediately poured herself another drink. "There's always further to fall. Always. Always." She moved from the table, holding her glass, and leaned against the icebox door. "And I did everything he wanted. I let him have his way. It wasn't me. It wasn't me." She gestured aimlessly with her glass, tried to drink from it, dropped it, and suddenly fell on her knees beside the table, her hands against her belly, weeping. Stupidly, he picked up the glass, afraid that she would cut herself. She was kneeling in the spilt whiskey, which had stained the edges of her skirt. He dropped the broken glass in the brown paper bag they used for garbage. He was afraid to go near her. He was afraid to touch her. It was almost as though she had told him that she had been infected with the plague. His arms trembled with this revulsion, and every act of the body seemed unimaginably vile. And yet, at the same time, as he stood helpless and stupid in the kitchen which had abruptly become immortal, or which, in any case, would surely live as long as he lived, and follow him everywhere, his heart began to beat with a newer, stonier anguish, which destroyed the distance called pity, and placed him very nearly in her body, beside that table, on the dirty floor. The single yellow light beat terribly down on them both. He went to her, resigned and tender and helpless, her sobs seeming to make his belly sore. And nevertheless, for a moment, he could not touch her. He did not know how. He thought, unwillingly, of all the whores, black whores, with whom he had coupled, and what he had hoped for from them, and he was gripped in a kind of retrospective nausea. What would they see when they looked into each other's faces again? "Come on, Ida," he whispered. "Come on, Ida. Get up." And at last he touched her shoulders, trying to force her to rise. She tried to check her sobs. She put both hands on the table. "I'm all right," she murmured. "Give me a handkerchief." He knelt beside her and thrust his handkerchief, warm and wadded, but fairly clean, into her hand. She blew her nose. He kept his arm around her shoulder. "Stand up," he said. "Go wash your face. Would you like some coffee?" She nodded her head yes, and slowly rose. He rose with her. She kept her head down and moved swiftly, drunkenly, past him into the bathroom. She locked the door. He had the spinning sensation of having been through all this before. He lit a flame under the coffee pot, making a mental note to break down the bathroom door if she were silent too long, if she were gone too long. But he heard the water running, and, beneath it, the sound of the rain. He ate a pork chop greedily with a piece of bread and drank a glass of milk. For he was trembling. It had to be because of hunger. Otherwise, for the moment, he felt nothing. The coffee pot, now beginning to growl, was real, and the blue fire beneath it, and the pork chops in the pan, and the milk which seemed to be turning sour in his belly. The coffee cups, as he thoughtfully washed them, were real, and the water which ran into them over his heavy, long hands. Sugar and milk were real, and he set them on the table, another reality. And cigarettes were real, and he lit one. Smoke poured from his nostrils, and a detail that he needed for his novel, which he had been searching for months, fell neatly and vividly, like the tumblers of a lock, into place in his mind. It seemed impossible that he should not have thought of it before. It illuminated, justified, clarified everything. He would work on it later tonight. He thought that perhaps he should make a note of it now. He started toward his work table. The telephone rang. He picked up the receiver at once, stealthily, as though someone were ill or sleeping in the house, and whispered into it. "Hello?" "Hello, Vivaldo. It's Eric." "Eric!" He was overjoyed. He looked quickly toward the bathroom door. "How did things go?" "Well, Cass is beautiful, as you know, but life is grim." "As I know." "Has anything been decided?" "Not really, no. She just called me a few minutes ago. I haven't been home long. Oh, thanks for your note. She thinks that she might go up to New England for a little while, with the kids. Richard hasn't come home yet." "Where is he?" "He's probably out getting drunk." "Who with?" "Well, Ellis, maybe?" They both halted at the name. The wires hummed. Vivaldo looked at the bathroom door again. "You knew about that, Eric, didn't you, this morning?" "Knew about what?" He dropped his voice lower and struggled to say it. "Ida. You knew about Ida and Ellis. Cass told you." There was silence for a moment. "Yes." Then, "Who told you?" "Ida." "Oh. Poor Vivaldo." After a moment. "But it's better that way, isn't it? I didn't think that I was the one to tell you, especially not this morning." Vivaldo was silent. "Vivaldo?" "Yes." "Don't you think I was right? Are you sore at me?" "Don't be silly. Never in this world. It's much better this way." He cleared his throat, slowly, deliberately, for he suddenly wanted to weep. "Vivaldo, it's a terrible time to ask you, I know, but do you think it's at all likely that you and Ida will feel up to coming over to my joint tomorrow night or the night after?" "What's up?" "Eve will be here in the morning. I know we'd like to meet my friends." "That was the cablegram, huh?" "Yes." "Are you glad, Eric?" "I guess so. Right now I'm just scared. I don't know whether to try to sleep. It's so early, but it feels like midnight. Or go to a movie, or what?" "I'd love to go to a movie with you, but I guess I can't." "No." "When will you let me know about tomorrow?" "I'll call you later tonight, or I'll call you in the morning." "Okay. If you call in the morning and miss, call back. I've got to go to Idlewild." "What time is it getting in?" "Oh, at dawn, practically. Naturally. 7 a.m., something convenient like that." Vivaldo laughed. "Poor Eric." "Yes. Life's catching up with us. Good night, Vivaldo." "Good night, Eric." He hung up, smiling thoughtfully, switched on his work table lamp, and scribbled his note. Then he walked into the kitchen, turned off the gas, and poured the coffee. He knocked on the bathroom door. "Ida, your coffee's getting cold." "Thank you. I'll be right out." He sat down in his work stool, and presently, here she came, scrubbed and quiet, looking like a child. He forced himself to look into her eyes. He did not know what she would see in them. He did not know what he felt. "Vivaldo," she said, standing, speaking quickly. "I just want you to know that I wouldn't have been with you so long and wouldn't have given you such a hard time if—" She faltered and held on with both hands to the back of a chair. "I didn't love you. That's why I had to tell you everything I've told you. I mean, I know I'm giving you a tough row to hoe." She sat down and picked up her coffee. "I had to say that while I could." She had the advantage of him, for he did not know what to say. He realized this with shame and fear. He wanted to say, "I love you," but the words would not come. He wondered what her lips would taste like now, what her body would be like for him now. He watched her quiet face. She seemed utterly passive, yet she was waiting, in a despair which steadily chilled and hardened, for some word, some touch of his. And he could not find himself, could not summon or concentrate enough of himself to make any sign at all. He stared into his cup, noting that black coffee was not black, but deep brown. Not many things in the world were really black, not even the night, not even the mines. And the light was not white either. Even the palest light held within itself some hint of its origins, in fire. He thought to himself that he had at last got what he wanted, the truth out of Ida, or the true Ida, and he did not know how he was going to live with it. He said, "Thank you for telling me. Everything you've told me. I know it wasn't easy." She said nothing. She made a faint, steamy sound as she sipped her coffee, and this sound was unaccountably, inexpressibly annoying. "And forgive me now if I don't seem to know just what to say. I may be a little stunned." He looked over at her, and a wilderness of anger, pity, love, and contempt, and lust all raged together in him. She, too, was a whore. How bitterly he had been betrayed. "I'm not trying to deny anything you've said, but just the same, there are a lot of things I don't understand, not really. Bear with me, please. Give me a little time." "Vivaldo," she said wearily. "Just one thing. I don't want you to be understanding. I don't want you to be kind, okay?" She looked directly at him, and an unnameable heat and tension flashed violently alive between them, as close to hatred as it was to love. She softened and reached out and touched his hand. "Promise me that." "I promise you that," he said. And then, furiously, "You seem to forget that I love you." They stared at each other. Suddenly, he reached out and pulled her to him, trembling, with tears starting up behind his eyes, burning and blinding, and covered her face with kisses, which seemed to freeze as they fell. She clung to him. With a sigh, she buried her face in his chest. There was nothing erotic in it. They were like two weary children, and it was she who was comforting him. Her long fingers stroked his back, and he began, slowly, with a horrible, strangling sound, to weep, for she was stroking his innocence out of him. By and by, he was still. He rose and went to the bathroom and washed his face, and then sat down at his work table. She put on a record by Mahalia Jackson, In the Upper Room, and sat at the window, her hands in her lap, looking out over the sparkling streets. Much, much later, while he was still working and she slept, she turned in her sleep, and she called his name. He paused, waiting, staring at her, but she did not move again, or speak again. He rose and walked to the window. The rain had ceased. In the black blue sky, a few stars were scattered, and the wind roughly jostled the clouds along. 2. The sun struck, on steel, on bronze, on stone, on glass, on the gray water far beneath them, on the turret tops and the flashing windshields of crawling cars, on the incredible highways, stretching and snarling and turning for mile upon mile upon mile, on the houses, square and high, low and gabled, and on their howling antennae, on the sparse, weak trees, and on those towers in the distance of the city of New York. The plane tilted, dropped and rose, and the whole earth slanted, now leaning against the windows of the plane, now dropping out of sight. The sky was a hot, blank blue, and the static light invested everything with its own lack of motion. Only things could be seen from here, the work of people's hands, but the people did not exist. The plane rose up, up, as though loath to descend from this high tranquility, tilted, and Eve looked down, hoping to see the Statue of Liberty, though he had been warned that it could not be seen from here. Then the plane began, like a stone, to drop. The water rushed up at them, the motors groaned, the wings trembled, resisting the awful downward pull. Then, when the water was at their feet, the white strip of the landing flashed into place beneath them. The wheels struck the ground with a brief and heavy thud, and wires and lights and towers went screaming by. The hostess's voice came over the speaker, congratulating them on their journey and hoping to see them soon again. The hostess was very pretty. He had intermittently flirted with her all night, delighted to discover how easy this was. He was drunk and terribly weary, and filled with an excitement which was close to panic. In fact, he had burned his way to the outer edge of drunkenness and weariness, into a diamond-hard sobriety. With the voice of the hostess, the people of this planet sprang out of the ground, pushing trucks and waving arms and crossing roads and vanishing into or erupting out of buildings. The voice of the hostess asked the passengers please to remain seated until the aircraft had come to a complete halt. Eve touched the package which contained the brandy and cigarettes he had bought in Shannon, and he folded his copies of France Soir and Le Monde and Paris Match, for he knew that Eric would like to see them. On the top of a brightly colored building, people were driven against the sky. He looked for Eric's flaming hair, feeling another excitement, an excitement close to pain well up in him. But the people were too far away. They were faceless still. He watched them move, but there was no movement which reminded him of Eric. Still, he knew that Eric was there, somewhere in that faceless crowd, waiting for him, and he was filled, all at once, with an extraordinary peace and happiness. Then the plane came slowly to a halt. As the plane halted, the people in the cabin seemed, collectively, to sigh, and discovered that the power of movement had been returned to them. Off came safety belts, down came packages, papers, and coats. The faces they had worn when hanging, at the mercy of mysteries they could not begin to fathom, in the middle of the air, were now discarded for the faces which they wore on earth. The housewife, traveling alone, who had been, during their passage, a rather flirtatious girl, became a housewife once again. Her face responded to her proddings as abjectly as her hat. The businessman who had spoken to Eve about the waters of Lake Michigan and the days when he had hiked and fished there, relentlessly put all of this behind him and solemnly and cruelly tightened the knot in his tie. Eve was not wearing a tie. He was wearing a light blue shirt with short sleeves, and he carried a light sport jacket, and he thought now, with some terror, that this had probably been a mistake. He was not really in America yet, after all, and might not be allowed to enter. But there was nothing he could do about it now. He straightened his collar and put on his jacket and ran his fingers through his hair, which was probably too long. He cursed himself and wished that he could ask one of his fellow passengers for reassurance. But his seatmate, a young man who played the organ in Montana, was now frowning and breathing hard, and straightening as much of himself as could decently be reached. He had been very friendly during the journey, and had even asked Eve to come and see him, if he ever came to Montana. But now Eve realized that he had not been given any address, and that he knew only the man's first name, which was Peter. And it was only too clear that he could not ask for any information now. Nearly everyone on the plane knew, for he had been very high-spirited and talkative, that he was French, and coming to the States for the first time. And some of them knew that he had a friend in New York, who was an actor. This had all seemed perfectly all right while they were in the middle of the air, but now, on the ground, and in the light, hard and American, of sober second thought, it all seemed rather suspect. He felt helplessly French, and he had never felt French before. And he felt their movement away from him, decently but definitely, with nervous and, as it were, backward smiles. They were making it clear that he could make no appeal to them, for they did not know who he was. It flashed through him that, of course, he had a test to pass. He had not yet entered the country. Perhaps he would not pass the test. He watched them fill the aisles, and he moved backward from them, into his familiar loneliness and contempt. "Good luck," said his seatmate quickly, and took his place in the line. He would probably have said the same words, as quickly, and in the same tone of voice, to a friend about to be carried off to prison. Eve sighed, and remained in his seat, waiting for the load in the aisle to lighten. He thought bleakly, "Le plus dur reste à faire." Then he joined the line, and moved slowly toward the door. The hostesses stood there, smiling and saying goodbye. The sun was bright on their faces, and on the faces of the disembarking passengers. They seemed, as they turned and disappeared, to be stepping into a new and healing light. He held his newspapers under one arm, shifted his package from hand to hand, straightened his belt, trembling. The hostess with whom he had flirted was nearest the door. "Au revoir," she said, with the bright and generous and mocking smile possessed by so many of his countrywomen. He suddenly realized that he would never see her again. It had not occurred to him, until this moment, that he could possibly have left behind him anything which he might, one day, long for and need with all his heart. "Bon courage," she said. He smiled and said, "Merci, mademoiselle. Au revoir." And he wanted to say, "Vous êtes très jolie." But it was too late. He had hit the light. The sun glared at him, and everything wavered in the heat. He started down the extraordinary steps. When he hit the ground, a voice above him said, "Bonjour, mon gars. Soyez le bienvenu." He looked up. Eric leaned on the rail of the observation deck, grinning, wearing an open white shirt and khaki trousers. He looked very much at ease, at home, thinner than he had been, with his short hair spinning and flaming about his head. Eve looked up joyously and waved, unable to say anything. "Eric." And all his fear left him. He was certain now that everything would be all right. He whistled to himself as he followed the line which separated him from the Americans into the examination hall. But he passed his examination with no trouble, and in a very short time his passport was eventually stamped and handed back to him, with a grin and a small joke, the meaning but not the good nature of which escaped him. Then he was in a vaster hall, waiting for his luggage, with Eric above him, smiling down on him through glass. Then even his luggage belonged to him again, and he strode through the barriers, more high-hearted than he had ever been as a child, into that city which the people from heaven had made their home. Istanbul, December 10th, 1961.
This has been a presentation of BBC Audiobooks America.